Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Pension files can tell us a lot about Civil War veterans. After reading Henry Robert Graham's wife's application, I learned a lot about Harry. My impression was that he's the kind of guy who made friends easily. Folks liked to be around him. He was a popular person. You might think of him as the life of the party. In 1860, the then 30-year-old blue-eyed carpenter with the easygoing disposition from New York City joined the New York State Militia, the 8th New York State Militia. You students of the Civil War know that these militia outfits were essentially the National Guard of the period. They operated in coordination with local and state government to protect and defend the citizenry, with a smaller central government and a tiny regular army. Now, the 8th was known as the Washington Grays, and it traced its origins to 1786. The gray because of the gray uniforms. Its members wearing those natty gray uniforms were generally popular, upstanding citizens living by moral codes and military tradition. And it's no wonder that Harry, Mr. Popular, joined them. He quickly made friends and blended in and became a sergeant by the time the Civil War started. After Fort Sumter, the 8th, the Washington Grays, were called up for a 3-month federal activation and left New York City for Washington, D.C. Harry, now a sergeant in Company D, went with them. In July 21st, 1861, the regiment fought at First Bull Run. The experience of the New Yorkers was similar to that of many Union regiments. It was an encouraging beginning as the men and officers charged ahead and drove back the rebels. Then the rebels countered and put up a stiff resistance that eventually turned the tide of the fight. In the chaos and confusion of the battle, the 8th scattered and got mixed up with regular army troops commanded by Major George Sykes. And that was pretty much the end of the day. The battle is well remembered for the array of uniforms on both sides of different colors and styles. The 8th is a case in point. Remember, they're wearing gray, while other Union regiments are wearing a variety of shades of blue, more gray, various zouave styles, and other crazy combinations consistent with the non-standard nature of these early military times. You can see Harry here. He's pictured in that gray uniform wearing an overcoat. Probably did not have the overcoat on in the heat of summer, but you get the idea. Note the blue cap with the regimental letter 8 surrounded by a wreath. Probably his only connection to Union blue. As referenced, didn't go so well for the Union Army. In the end, U.S. forces skedaddled back to the nation's capital. The 8th left its wounded and medical personnel behind. 38 of the Grays became casualties. Harry was one of the survivors. He got caught up in the retreat and made his way back to Washington, D.C. At the end of their 3-month enlistment, they went back to New York City, but they were called up twice more during the war. In 1862 and again in 1863, Harry stepped up each time. During that 1862 call-up, that was another 3-month enlistment. They spent the time mainly at Yorktown, Virginia, while the Peninsula Campaign was going on. By this time, Harry was second lieutenant of the company. In 1863, that call-up, that was a 30-day activation during Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North that ended at Gettysburg. The 8th was stationed in the vicinity of Harrisburg, and they did not confront the enemy. I have a second image of Harry pictured here. This is him in the uniform of a first lieutenant. Notice the gray is now gone. We're a little bit later in the war, and that gray has now been replaced by the more familiar Union blue. During the war years, during those three call ups, Harry met Julia, so Julia Clark. They fell in love and they married in 1865. Julia was from Albany, that was her hometown, and Harry set aside his carpentry tools and all of his buddies in New York and joined Julia in Albany. Her father, his father in law now, sold stoves for a living. Harry joined the company. They formed a partnership, but that partnership dissolved 2 years later, due in part to his father, who thought Harry's ideas for the business were a little too extravagant, a little too big city, a little too upscale for the humble, practical citizens of Albany, who he believed wanted a simple, solid stove with no frills. Harry then struck out on his own, made an attempt at his own business, and lost his shirt and all the money that was invested by his wife's family. She later wrote in that pension file that Harry was weak financially. I think that was her way of saying that he was not a good businessman. The pension suggests that the marriage was also weak. There's rumors that the Grahams did not get on well together, according to affidavits. Eventually, Harry left Albany and left Julia, headed back to New York City, landed a bookkeeping job. She stayed in Albany and taught school. After a few years, she moved to New York City to join Harry, suggesting a reconciliation might be in order. But Harry promptly stopped working and lived off of her earnings. Arguments about money and who was responsible became frequent. All this was going on throughout the 1860s and 1870s. Familiar family problems. In 1876, Harry had enough. He told his family he was leaving, and he blamed it because he said that Julia was having an affair. He reached out to his buddies in the 8th, his old Army buddies, got some money from them. He was out of cash, borrowed some money from his buddies, and then he disappeared. Nobody could find him. Now, whether or not Julia was messing around with other guys is, I don't know, it's unknown. The pension file doesn't really tell us. The veracity of Harry's claim is questionable. It's also supported or not supported by Julia, who tried to track him down, was unsuccessful. Remember, that was in 1876. 15 years later, in 1891, Julia, tired, out of money, assuming that somehow Harry had disappeared and died, went ahead and filed for a war widow's pension, which she deserved as she was married to Harry. She filed that pension application with the government, sent it off to Washington, and she was surprised to learn that the application was sent back and rejected. Why? Because Harry was alive. The government revealed in their application rejection that, well, Harry was already drawing a disability pension in California, where he worked as a carpenter, his original profession, in El Verano, and that he was married to a woman named Anna. Julia tried to contact Harry. Probably no surprise. She didn't get a response. She tried it in 1903, tried again in 1904, and finally she learned that he had actually died in 1903 from syphilis. Julia continued on, lived a relatively long life, dying in 1938. So there you have it, the story of Harry Graham, Julia Graham, and some of the personal details you can learn from Pension File. Thanks for listening. See you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.